Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story. All right, it is Hump Day, Wednesday, and we've got some mail. See, Crazy Crafter has sent us another card. I think she likes us. All right, hold on. I'm going to get this open. All right, it says, bad ideas make the best memories. Yes, I have some stories that would definitely agree with that. And then there's an envelope, which I have no idea what that says. Something, oh, so very grateful. All right, and then it says here, Sue, hope all is well in your family. Thank you for supporting my channel. You are very welcome. I enjoy your channel. Find it very relaxing and enjoyable. All those cards and crafts that you do. Have a blessed Easter, which we did have a lovely Easter, despite the weather. Your friend Addie, so I need to add that name to my list here, aka Crazy Crafter Adventures. Check out Addie if you like crafts or cards. She makes some beautiful cards, as you can see here. This lovely card that she made. So check her out, like, share, comment, and enjoy Joe's ramblings.
Hello, greeting from the Bud Files. This is the Bearded Historian with our weekly little bit of fun. Going through the history books. We saw on April 11th, back in 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off for its mission to go visit the moon, and things didn't go quite exactly as planned. Now, for a little bit of background information, you got to realize Apollo missions, originally, designed to go to the moon, were set up with what we call the Saturn V rockets. Think of it as a skyscraper that's going to lift off of the ground. Great big rocket. But also to think about, back then, a lot of what NASA was working with, going all the way back to, the 50s and 60s, everything that was done back then was a lot of trial and error. The first rockets that, we were using were, formerly came out of World War II with the V2 weapons. The Nazi Germany rockets that they were firing over into England near the end of World War II. We happened to luck out capturing several of them, and we also made a deal with certain German scientists to give us the ability to take and advance our own knowledge in the space race. A couple things actually caused us to speed up the process. One of them was when we discovered Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union, and it in turn pretty much forced our government to realize, hey, something, we're in a race, and it's not something we want to lose. Because when you think about Sputnik, their idea was, well, guess what? If they can launch a satellite, they could most certainly launch a missile. And that was something that kind of scared the government into thinking, let's start taking this a little more serious. Now, a lot of things took place into 1961 when the president at that time, John F. Kennedy, made his famous speech about wanting to go to the moon. And he said before the end of the decade, we were going to set foot on the moon. That pretty much put NASA on the clock to say, we need to start training, we need to start getting equipment lined up, we need to start getting astronauts prepared, we need to find ways that we can launch, humans into space and bring them back safely. They started out with smaller rockets and only a single-man unit. They started doing the Liberty Bell projects. They started working with the Gemini projects, where 2 astronauts were able to go up. They worked with the idea of working in spacewalk situations. A lot of things came down to the point that originally, when we were launching astronauts into space, they wouldn't make a full rotation of the Earth. They'd only go suborbit. Then they'd come back and we'd rescue them. Then they were able to start, doing 2 or 3 orbits around the Earth. Space exploration and NASA, they had to do baby steps. And, nowadays, we're looking at the SpaceX rockets and this other mission that's planning on trying to go back to the moon. It's all baby steps. Because back then, there was no manual, there was no books, there was no blueprints. Everything took, steps. And even the constructions for these huge, monstrous Saturn V rockets was just, completely impressive. Now, going back to this Apollo 13 mission, the things that made it rather interesting was that, NASA was contracted originally to build 15 Saturn V rockets. Now, to achieve that goal, this was at a time that nobody had any idea how many missions it would require. Success was actually obtained in 1969 when the Apollo 11 mission occurred. That left 9 rockets remaining for the hoped for a total of 10 landings. After the excitement of the Apollo 11, the general public kind of went, it's a budget, it's expensive. Even with the successful landing, they still canceled the Apollo 20 mission, which I'm like, oh, that's really intelligent. And it was also interesting because despite the successful lunar landing, missions were considered so risky, astronauts couldn't get life insurance. And they couldn't provide for their families if they died in space. Now, before the first U.S. astronaut even entered space in 1961, NASA was also taking their own little baby steps. They had a centralized facility that they're planning on to communicate with spacecraft, and monitor performance had begun, for the most part, the brainchild of Christopher C. Kraft Jr., who became NASA's first flight director. This is the guy that basically is running the whole operation from the ground. During the John Glenn Mercury Friendship 7 flight in February of 1962, one of Kraft's decisions was overruled by NASA managers. He was vindicated in post-mission analysis and implemented a rule that during the mission, the flight director's word would be absolute. To overrule him, NASA would have to fire him on the spot. That's basically putting it in one guy's hands. Pretty definitive. Flight directors during Apollo had a 1-sentence job description. The flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success. Now, in 1965, Houston's Mission Control Center opened, in part designed by Kraft and now named for him. In mission control, each flight controller, in addition to monitoring telemetry from the spacecraft, was in communication via voice loop to specialists in the staff support room, or back room, who focused on specific spacecraft systems. Now, Apollo 13 was going to be the part of the second H mission set. This was meant to demonstrate precision lunar landings and explore specific sites on the moon. With Kennedy's goal accomplished in Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 demonstrated the astronauts could perform a precision landing, mission planners were able to focus more than just landing safely and having astronauts minimally trained in geology, gather lunar samples to take back home. This is going to basically be searching for specific rocks, and it also was foretold with the, motto ex luna scientia, or in English, from the moon, knowledge. Now the crew for this particular mission, their names are kind of synonymous because, well, all of us watched Apollo 13, the movie, which personally I enjoyed the heck out of. It was very well done, and it followed very closely to what actually happened. In fact, there's been several people that have said that it's the closest anybody has ever come to making a movie that followed the real thing. I mean, even all the way down to the mock-ups of this, everything. First name was the mission commander, Jim Lovell. He was 42 at the time. A graduate at the United States Naval Academy. Had been a naval aviator and a test pilot. So he was used to, working on situations where if something happened out of the blue, he could calmly, coolly, and well be able to put it into operation. Smart guy. He was selected into the second group of astronauts in 1962. He flew with Frank Borman in the Gemini 7 in 65, and with Buzz Aldrin in Gemini 12 the following year. He was also flying in the Apollo 8, the first spacecraft that would actually orbit the moon. Now, at the time of Apollo 13, Lovell was a NASA astronaut with the most time in space, 572 hours in 3 missions. That's a guy that's got his wings. Okay. Next guy up, the command module pilot, was a guy named Jack Swigert, 38 years old, held a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering and a Master of Science in Aerospace Science, served in the Air Force and in the State Air National Guards, and was an engineering test pilot before being selected to the 5th group of astronauts in 1966. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, was 35 years old. He held a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering and had been a Marine Corps fighter pilot and was a civilian research pilot for NASA when he was selected for the Group 5 astronauts. Now, according to standard Apollo crew rotation, the prime crew for Apollo 13 would have been the backup crew for Apollo 10, with Mercury and Gemini veteran Gordon Cooper in command, Don F. Easley as CMP, and Edgar Mitchell as LMP. Now, Deke Slayton, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations, never intended to rotate Cooper and LZ to a prime crew assignment, as both were out of favor. Cooper had a lax attitude towards training, Isley for incidents aboard Apollo 7, and an extramarital affair. He assigned them to a backup crew because no other veteran astronauts were available. Slayton's original choices for Apollo 13 were Alan Shepard as commander, Stuart Rosa as CMP, and Mitchell as LMP. However, management felt Shepard needed more training time, as he had only recently resumed active status after having surgery for an inner ear disorder, and had not flown since 1961. Thus, Lowell's crew, himself, Hayes, and Ken Mattingly, having all backed up Apollo 11 and being slated for Apollo 13 or Apollo 14, were swapped with Shepard's. Now, Swigert was originally the CMP of Apollo's 13 backup crew, with John Young as commander and Charles Duke as lunar module pilot. 7 days before launch, Duke contracted rubella from a friend of his son. They exposed both the prime and backup crews, who trained together. Of the 5, only Mattingly was not immune through prior exposure. Normally, if any member of the prime crew had to be grounded, the remaining crew would be replaced as well, and the backup crew substituted, but Duke's illness ruled this out. So, 2 days before launch, Mattingly was replaced by Swigert. Mattingly, creatively enough, never developed rubella, but would become rather instrumental helping from the ground. Now, for Apollo, this third crew of astronauts, known as the support crew, was designated in addition to the prime and backup crews used on projects Mercury and Gemini. Slayton created the support crew because James McDivitt, who would command Apollo 9, believed that with preparation going on in facilities across the U.S., meetings that needed a member of the flight crew would be missed. Support crew members were to assist as directed by the mission commander. Usually low in seniority, they assembled the mission's rules, flight plan, checklist, and kept them updated. For Apollo 13, this was Vance D. Brand, Jack Lozma, and either William Pogue or Joseph Kerwin. Now, for Apollo 13, the flight directors were Gene Kranz. His name is pretty much, spoken word in NASA halls, even to this day. The white team, or lead flight director, was Gene Lunny. Black team, Milton Windler. Maroon team, and Gary Griffin of the gold team. The Capcoms, the person in mission control during the Apollo program, an astronaut who is responsible for voice communications, for Apollo 13 was Kerwin, Brand, Luzma, Young, and Mattingly. Now, for the flight itself, things from the start had a few issues. One of the first things that was to go wrong was the center inboard engine on the second stage shut down 2 minutes early. This caused a severe pogo oscillation. Starting with Apollo 10, the vehicle's guidance system was designed to shut the engine down in response to chamber pressure excursions. Pogo oscillations had occurred on Titan objects used during the Gemini program and on previous Apollo missions, but on Apollo 13 they were amplified by an interaction with turbopump cavitation. Now, to fix this pogo was ready for the mission, but flight pressure did not permit the hardware's integration into the Apollo 13 vehicle. A post-flight investigation realized that the engine was one cycle away from a catastrophic failure. It's the 4 outboard engines and the CIVB third stage would burn longer to compensate, and the vehicle achieved very close to the planned circular parking orbit of 190 kilometers or 100 nautical miles, followed by a translunar injection about 2 hours later, setting the mission on course for the moon. Away we go. After that TLI, Swigert performed the separation and transposition maneuvers following the CSM Odyssey to the LM Aquarius, and the spacecraft pulled away from its third stage. Ground controllers then sent the third stage on a course to impact the moon in the range of the Apollo 12 seismometer, which it did just over 3 days into the mission. The crew settled in for their 3-day trip to Fra Mauro. Into the mission with the TV camera running, the crew performed a burn to place Apollo 13 in a hybrid trajectory. The departure from a free return trajectory meant that if no further burns were performed, Apollo 13 would miss the Earth on a return trajectory rather than intercept it as with a free return. A free return trajectory could only reach sites near the lunar equator. A hybrid trajectory, which, with higher latitudes, such as the Fra Mauro, to be reached, communications were enlivened when Swigert realized the last-minute rush. He omitted to file his federal tax return, due April 15th, amid laughter from the mission controllers. Asked how he could get an extension, he found that he would be entitled to a 60-day extension for being out of the country at the deadline. Definitely out and above. Now, entry into the LM to test its systems had been scheduled for 5800. When the crew awoke on the third day of the mission, they were informed it had been moved up 3 hours, and later moved up by another additional hour. A television broadcast was scheduled for 5500. Lovell, acting as MC, showed the audience the interiors of Odyssey and Aquarius. The audience was limited since none of the television networks were carrying the broadcast. Thanks a lot, guys. forcing Marilyn Lovell, Jim Lovell's wife, to go to the VIP room at Mission Control if she wanted to watch her husband and his crewmates. Now, about 6.5 minutes after the TV broadcast, approximately 5600, or doing the math, about 10 o'clock that night, Apollo 13 was about 180,000 nautical miles away from Earth. Hayes was completing the shutdown of the LM after testing the systems, while Lowell stowed the TV camera. Jack Lozma at Capcom sent minor instructions to Swigert, including changing the attitude of the craft to facilitate photography of the Comet Bennett. Well, the pressure sensor in one of the oxygen tanks had earlier appeared to be malfunctioning in the service module. So Cy Livergott, the ECOM in charge of monitoring the CSM's electrical system, requested the stirring of fans in the tanks to be activated. Normally this is done once daily. A stir would destratify the contents of the tank, making the pressure readings more accurate. Flight Director Krantz had Livergott wait a few moments for the crew to settle down after the telecast, and Luzma relayed the request to Swigert, who activated the switches controlling the fans, and after a few seconds turned them off again. Well, 95 seconds after Swigert activated those switches, the astronauts heard a pretty large bang accompanied by fluctuations in the electrical power and the firing of the attitude control thrusters. Communications and telemetry to Earth were lost for 1.8 seconds, until the system automatically corrected by switching the high-gain S-band antenna used for translunar communications from narrow beam to wide beam mode. The accident happened about 3:08 Uniform Transit Time, basically 10:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April the 13th. For those of you who are slightly superstitious, Friday the 13th. Swigert reported 26 seconds later, "Hey Houston, we've had a problem here." He was echoed by Lovell. Shortly later, "Houston, we've had a problem. We've had the main B bus undervolt." Now, William Fenner, who was the guidance officer, who was the first to report the problem at the control room to Krantz. Lowell's initial thought was hearing the noise that the Hayes had activated the lunar module's cabin repressurization valve, which does produce a bang. He enjoyed doing that to startle his crewmates, but Lowell could see that Hayes was nowhere near and had no idea what had happened. Swigert originally thought a micrometeorite might have struck the LM, but he and Lowell quickly realized that there was no leak. The main bus B undervolt meant that there was insufficient voltage produced by the service module's 3 fuel cells, fueled by hydrogen and oxygen piped from their respective tanks to the second of the SM's 2 electric power distribution systems. Almost everything in the CSM required power. Although the bus momentarily returned to normal status, soon both buses A and B were short on voltage. Hayes checked the status of the fuel cells and found that 2 of them were dead. Mission rules forbade entering lunar orbit unless all fuel cells were operational. Well, in the minutes after the accident, there were several unusual readings showing Tank 2 was empty and Tank 1's pressure slowly falling, that the computer on the spacecraft had reset, and that the high-gain antenna was not working. Livergott initially missed worrying signs from Tank 2 following the stir, as he was focusing on Tank 1, believing that its reading would be a good guide of what was present in Tank 2, as did the controllers supporting him in the back room. When Krantz questioned Livergott on this, he initially responded there might be false readings due to an instrumentation problem. He often was teased about that in years to come. Lovell, looking out the window, reported a gas of some sort venting into space, making it clear that there was a serious problem. Okay, let's recap. Here, there, X hundred 100,000 miles away from Earth. 210,000 miles, 180,000 nautical miles from Earth. You are venting something. You don't know what it is. So that right there is a sign that there is definitely something wrong. Now, fuel cells needed oxygen to operate. When oxygen tank 1 ran dry, the remaining fuel cell would shut down, meaning the CSM's only significant sources of power in oxygen would be from the command module's batteries and its oxygen surge tank. These would be needed for the final hours of the mission, but the remaining fuel cell, already starved for oxygen, was drawing from the surge tank. Krantz ordered that surge tank isolated, saving its oxygen, but meant the remaining fuel cell would die within 2 hours, as the oxygen in tank 1 was consumed or leaked away. The volume surrounding the spacecraft was filled with a myriad of small bits of debris from the accident, complicating any efforts to use the stars for navigation. The mission's goal simply became getting the astronauts back to Earth alive. This is where the phrase turning it into a lifeboat that was mentioned in the movie was highly accurate. Because they, at the stage that they were at, they couldn't abort, they couldn't use a fuel critical return, so their best option was to rotate around the moon and come back in a normal trajectory. Now, the lunar module had charged batteries, full oxygen tanks for the use on the lunar service, so Krantz directed the astronauts power up the LEM and use it as a lifeboat, a scenario anticipated but considered unlikely. Now, procedures for using this in this way had been developed by flight controllers in a training simulation for Apollo 10, in which the LM was needed for survival but could not be powered up in time. Had Apollo 13's accident occurred on the return voyage, when the LM already jettisoned, the astronauts would have died, as they would have followed an explosion in lunar orbit, including one while Lovell and Hayes were walking on the moon. Oops. A direct key decision for the choice of a return path. The direct abort would have used the service module's main engine, but they weren't certain if this was damaged in the explosion. Also, the fuel cells would have had to at least had another hour to meet that power requirement, so Krantz decided on that longer route. The spacecraft would swing around the moon before heading back to Earth. Apollo 13 was on the hybrid trajectory, which brought it back to Fra Mauro. It now needed to be brought back to a free return. The LM's descent propulsion system, although not as powerful, could do this, but the new software from mission control computers needed to be written by technicians. Guess what, guys? You're getting paid to do extra. As the CM was being shut down, Lovell copied down its guidance system orientation information and performed hand calculations to transfer it to the LM's guidance system, which had been turned off. At his request, Mission Control checked his figures. If you think about it, this was a guy up in a tiny little room doing calculations with a slide rule. All of us remember trigonometry and algebra and all those fun things. This guy was living it. Now, at basically 61 hours, 29 minutes, 43 seconds, and 49 milliseconds, the DPS burn of 33.23 seconds took Apollo 13 back to the free return trajectory. Now, this change would get Apollo 13 back to Earth in about 4 days' time, though the splashdown in the Indian Ocean, where NASA had few recovery forces, Jerry Bostic and other flight dynamics officers were anxious to both to shorten the travel time and to move the splashdown to the Pacific Ocean, where main recovery forces were located. One option would shave 36 hours off the return time, but required jettisoning the service module. This would expose the CM's heat shield to space during return journey, something that it had not been designed for. This also had other proposals that were floated. After a meeting involving NASA officials and engineers, the senior individuals present, they decided on a burn using the DPS, which would save 12 hours, and land Apollo 13 in the Pacific. This PC+2 burn would take place 2 hours after they came to their closest approach to the moon. During this event, the Apollo 13 would set a record per Guinness Book of World Records, in which stands, to this day, the furthest distance from Earth by a crewed spacecraft, 400,171 kilometers from Earth at 7:21 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April the 14th. Now, while preparing for the burn, crews were told that the SIVB had impacted the moon as planned, leading Lovell to quip, well, at least something worked on this flight. Cran's white team of the mission controllers, who'd spent most of their time supporting the other teams and developing procedures, urgently needed to get the astronauts home and took their consoles for the PC-2 procedure. Normally, the accuracy of such a burn could be assured by checking alignment Lovell had transferred from the LM computer against position of the stars astronauts used for navigation, but light glinting off the many pieces of debris accompanying the spacecraft made that impractical. Astronauts accordingly used the one star available, whose position could not be obscured, the sun. Houston also informed them that the moon would be centered on the commander's window of the LEM as they made the burn, which is almost perfect, less than 1 foot per second off. The burn would last 4 minutes, 23 seconds, and then the crew shut down most of the LEM systems to conserve the consumables. Now, going through the process, they started coming into a couple problems. The first one was that they were having a problem removing carbon dioxide. They were absorbing a lot more, they were breathing out a lot more carbon dioxide than they had been expecting. Originally, their stock of canisters of lithium hydroxide pellets would be enough for 2 astronauts for 45 hours on the moon, was not enough to support 3 astronauts for the return journey to Earth. They had enough canisters, but they were of different shape and size to the LEMs, hence unable to be used in the LEMs equipment. Now, off come our engineers on the ground devised a way to bridge this gap. Using plastic covers ripped from procedure manuals, duct tape, everybody loves duct tape, and other items available to the spacecraft. Engineers referred to the improvised device as the mailbox. The procedure for building the device was read to the crew by Capcom Joseph Kerwin over the course of an hour and was built by Swigert and Hayes as carbon dioxide levels began dropping almost immediately. Lovell later described this improvisation as a fine example of cooperation between ground and space. Now, CSM's electricity came from the fuel cells product. It produced water as a byproduct, but the LEM was powered by silver zinc batteries, which did not. So both electrical power and water needed for equipment cooling as well as drinking would be critical. The LEM power consumption was reduced to the lowest level possible. Swigert was able to fill some drinking bags with water from the CM's water tap, but even assuming the rationing of personal consumption, Hayes initially calculated they would run out of water for cooling about 5 hours before re-entry. This seemed acceptable because systems of Apollo 11's LM, once jettisoned in lunar orbit, had continued to operate for 7 to 8 hours, even with the water cut off. In the end, Apollo 13 would return to Earth with 28.2 pounds of water remaining. The crew's rations were 6.8 fluid ounces of water per person per day, and the 3 astronauts had lost a total of 31 pounds among them, even having Hayes develop a UTI due to this. They think the infection was probably caused by a reduced water intake, but microgravity and the effects of cosmic radiation might have also impaired his immune system's reaction to the pathogen. Now, inside this darkened spacecraft, think about this a moment. This is South Dakota weather. The temperature inside dropped to as low as 3 Celsius or 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, that's one of our winters, you know. Those down in Florida are probably freezing to death. Down in Nevada, probably, thinking the apocalypse. Lowell considered having the crew don spacesuits, but decided this would be too hot. Instead, Lovell and Hayes wore their lunar EVA boots, and Swigert put on an extra coverall. All three astronauts were cold, especially Swigert, who had gotten his feet wet while filling the water bags and had no lunar overshoes. As they'd been told not to discharge the urn into space to avoid disturbing the trajectory, they had to store it in floating bags. Whee! Now, water would condense on the walls, although any condensation may have been behind equipment panels, caused no problems, partially because of the extensive electrical insulation improvements instituted after the Apollo 1 fire. Despite of all this, the crew voiced few complaints. Flight controller John Aaron, along with Mattingly and several flight engineers and designers, devised a procedure for powering the command module up from full shutdown, something never intended to be done in space, let alone Apollo 13's severe power and time constraints. The astronauts implemented the procedure without apparent difficulty. Krantz later credited all three astronauts, having been test pilots, accustomed to working in critical situations, with their lives on the line for their survival. Recognizing that the cold conditions combined with insufficient rest would hinder the time-critical startup of the command module prior to re-entry, at 133 hours into flight, mission control gave Lowell the okay to fully power up the LEM to raise the cabin temperature, which included restarting the LEM's guidance computer. Having started the LEM's computer running enabled Lowell to perform a navigational sighting and calibrate the LEM's inertial measurement unit. With the lunar module's computer aware of its location and orientation, the command module computer was later calibrated in reverse of the normal procedures used to set up the LEM, shaving steps from the restart process and increasing the accuracy of the PGN-CS controlled reentry. But with everything that happened, they were able to disengage the service module and start its general descent. They were able to make a successful splashdown into the Pacific. Interestingly enough, there's a time window that happens due to re-entry that usually lasts about 4 minutes. Due to everything that had happened, this was actually a 6-minute delay. It's kind of scared Houston because they're like, okay, did we lose them? Did they burn up in orbit? They didn't know if the heat shield had been damaged, but they were able to successfully parachute down in the Pacific on April 17th, 1970. They landed about 2 miles away from the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima. Other than fatigue, the crew was in good condition, except for Hayes with his urinary tract infection from insufficient water intake. The crew would stay overnight on the ship and flew to Pago Pago, American Samoa, the next day. Then they flew to Hawaii, where they would meet up with Richard Nixon, the president, and he would award them the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. They would stay overnight another night, and then were flown back to Houston. But a lot of people would go on to say that this was a successful failure because they were able to launch, orbit the moon, they were not able to land, and return to Earth safely. And it was a credit to the engineers who were able to pull a trick out of their hat, to say the least. But this has been the Bearded Historian. You folks have a good one, and we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.